Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on fairness in global climate action, by which we mean what should a country like the US be doing compared to a country like China, compared to a country like, say, Rwanda, when it comes to acting on climate change. My name is Brandon Wu. I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA.
And I'm Sivan Kartha, Senior Scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute.
So our organizations are part of a global coalition of groups that developed a methodology for answering exactly this question of what countries should be doing how much in terms of climate action. So here on your screen, you can see the list of organizations. You probably can't read it, but the point is that there's a lot of us. There's groups from the global north, from the global south, groups that focus on the environment, others on poverty and development. There are faith-based groups, trade unions, and labor groups. It's just a huge diversity of perspectives that all came together and agreed on a common framework for understanding what countries need to be doing to keep global average temperature rise under 1.5 degrees. And that's the ultimate goal, right? The Paris Agreement, the global agreement that countries signed in 2015 as a framework for cooperative climate action, has as its goal keeping global warming to under 1.5 degrees. Below that point, or beyond that point rather, we know that the impacts will just be unbearable for many communities and countries, especially in the global south. And to achieve a 1.5-degree goal, though, the world has to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions radically and on an incredibly short time scale. And no one country can do it alone. It has to be collective global climate action. So I'm going to walk through this chart, which will show us what we have to do. So on the horizontal axis, we have time, and on the vertical axis, we have global greenhouse gas emissions that have been put into the atmosphere and are causing climate change. So this line is historical emissions up until now, more or less. So emissions are rising across the world. And this is a baseline for the future where the world doesn't take a whole lot of climate action, and so emissions continue to rise. Now, this blue line shows an emissions curve, which is called the low energy demand scenario, developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That gives us a decent shot at keeping global warming under 1.5 degrees. So that shaded area is the work that we have to do. Obviously, there's a huge gap between that top and that bottom line. And here's an illustration of how we might divide up that work by country. So you can see the US at the top in red with a fairly large share of emissions cuts that we're responsible for, and then Europe and other wealthy countries are below that, and then China and India and other poor countries at the bottom. So the question is, and the question that we're going to address in this webinar is, how do we arrive at this division of labor? What's the formula for deciding that the US fair share of global emissions cuts is that size, what's shown here in red, compared to China's, compared to, say, that tiny sliver of yellow that's India? Now, fundamentally, the model is based on two principles, both of which are written into environmental law. The first is historical responsibility. And by that, we mean the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that a country has put into the atmosphere over time that are causing climate change. The second principle is capacity. So a country's national wealth, or the resources it can mobilize to combat climate change. This was said really clearly by Al Gore in a New York Times op-ed over a decade ago, actually. You can read that on your screen. But I want to point out that these two principles are not just specific to climate or even environmental law. They're really basic principles about how we think about fairness in general in everyday life. If you broke something, are you taking responsibility for fixing it? If you're wealthier than the next person, are you doing more than others to address common problems? So what we're doing here is taking very fundamental principles of fairness and applying them to global climate action.
Thanks, Brandon. As Brandon said, the CSO group who did this was really a broad group, and they came to it with different conceptions of what would be fair. What is the right way to interpret moral responsibility, and what is the right way to interpret a country's capacity? And so I'm going to walk through a few different ethical conceptions of what responsibility and capacity are, and then show the implications as far as countries' fair shares of the different conceptions. So starting with responsibility, let me talk about this with reference to three different possible responsibility benchmarks. In other words, three different ways of thinking about how far back in time we should go when thinking about what a country's moral responsibility for its emissions, for its contribution to the global burden of carbon dioxide, how that should be thought of. So the first benchmark um, is a benchmark that corresponds to considering that what a country is morally responsible for is everything it caused. Let's go back as far in time as we have good data for, 1850, and everything a country has emitted is what it has causal responsibility for, which is what it ultimately has moral responsibility for. A second conception is that it's not really everything you did going back, to the dawn of time. It's really just what the people living in your country today benefited from, not people who lived there 150 years ago. 1950 reflects a date at which we really started building up the industrial and urban and transportation infrastructure on which today's prosperity in each country is based. 1990 reflects a different conception of what a country's moral responsibility is still. It suggests that what you're responsible for is really what there really was a legal expectation to do. 1990 is when we started drafting a climate treaty, and that's the point at which countries should take responsibility for the emissions that they've emitted since. The CSO coalition felt that causal responsibility and the responsibility of a beneficiary are reasonable ways of thinking of what's fair, and they considered them reflective of equitable benchmarks. 1990 they didn't think of as fair. It's discussed, it's a way of thinking about moral responsibility, but it's not fair because actually it was well before then that not only did scientists know that this was a problem, but policymakers did too. So we're going to look at three benchmarks, two of which the CSO coalition thought of as fair, and the third of which, 1990, is just there for reference because it still provides interesting information about countries' fair shares compared to their pledges. Next slide, Brandon. So the second ethical principle has to do with capacity and what a country's capacity is. The typical way to think about capacity is as income. Income is so strongly correlated with your financial resources, with your technological resources, with your institutional abilities, and so it's a good indicator of a country's capacity. But it's very important to think about who is that income earned by and what is it used for. What we have here are three income distribution charts for three key countries, India, China, and the US. An income distribution chart is what you get if you were to array everybody in the country from poorest on the left-hand side to wealthiest on the right-hand side and plotted their income. And so what we see here is somewhat unsurprising. China is much wealthier than India, and the US is much wealthier than China. But not only do we have those quite striking disparities between countries, but we have quite striking disparities within countries. The wealthiest Indians are quite a bit wealthier than the poorest Indians, and the wealthiest Chinese are quite a bit wealthier than the poorest Chinese, and likewise for the US. We've also shown here a certain segment of the income that's in tan, and that reflects the share of income that really just goes toward meeting basic needs, toward meeting food needs and shelter needs and maybe education and healthcare. And so how you think about a country's capacity must relate to whether that income they earn is being spent on just meeting basic needs or spent on discretionary consumer items or luxury items. So what we've considered in this analysis is three different possible benchmarks. One benchmark that considers those consumer and luxury expenditures to count a lot more toward a country's capacity than its basic needs. And one that considers it to not really count that much more than the basic needs, and one somewhat in the middle. So a high progressivity, a medium progressivity, and a low progressivity benchmark is what we'll be showing the results for. Next, Brandon. So here we have the fair shares as calculated for a set of countries for 3 different equity benchmarks. The first one considers responsibility going back to 1850, causal responsibility, and high progressivity interpretation of capacity. The second considers responsibility going back to 1950, the beneficiary's responsibility, and a medium definition of capacity. And the third considers responsibility going back to 1990 and a low progressivity definition of capacity. Again, the CSO coalition felt that the dark green and the light green benchmarks were fair. They didn't converge on precisely one definition of responsibility or capability, but they thought a range could be reasonable, even if they reflect somewhat different conceptions of what fairness really is in terms of responsibility and capability. The gray benchmark is there because it's instructive. It shows us something interesting for what the implications are for a different conception of what's fair, even if this group agreed unanimously that it wasn't fair. The first thing to point out is that you get very different results, that the amount of emission reductions that should be made in the US, for example, under the 1850 and high progressivity benchmark is nearly 40 tons per person. Whereas under the 1990 low progressivity benchmarks, it's a little bit more than half of that. The not surprising trend you get here is that wealthier countries have higher fair shares of their reduction of the total global reductions under the benchmark that consider responsibility going back further in time and that are more progressive. And poorer countries have higher fair shares of the global effort under a benchmark that doesn't go back and far in time and is not as progressive. Note, the high progressivity and medium progressivity benchmarks, they're kind of reflective of tax codes and the amount of progressivity you'll find in typical tax codes. The low progressivity is actually much less progressive than almost any tax code globally. Now let me compare these fair shares to what countries have actually put on the table as far as their mitigation pledges. These red horizontal lines reflect the amount of mitigation that countries have pledged under the Paris Agreement. Some countries have an upper and lower line corresponding to their more ambitious and their less ambitious pledge, but there are some very clear patterns here. Wealthy countries all have pledged much, much less mitigation than their fair share would be under any of these benchmarks. Poorer countries, on the other hand, have pledged mitigation that's roughly in scale with their fair share under any of these benchmarks. The benchmarks differ considerably in terms of the moral perspective that they're reflecting. They differ considerably in terms of their quantitative implications, but the trend, regardless, is very clear. Now, Brandon is going to show you what happens when you zoom in on a country and look at what type of reductions would this really mean if the USA were to do its fair share. Taking, say, 30 roughly tons per person of reductions for the US, which amounts to about 10 gigatons of reductions. Brandon, show us what that would look like.
Great, thanks, Sivan. So this is a chart that looks at the US specifically. It's the same format as the one you saw earlier in the presentation for the whole planet. Again, that top line is US emissions historically, and then a baseline for a future in which we don't take very much climate action. And so our emissions continue to stay at a relatively stable level. Of course, what needs to happen is that blue line where our emissions fall dramatically. And that's what a fair share scenario would look like, where the world reaches 1.5 degrees and the US does its part. So the dots here represent what we committed to as part of the Paris Agreement, our pledges or our NDCs for 2025. And you'll see there that those red dots are nowhere close to where the blue line is at the same time at 2025. So there's a huge gap between what we've pledged and what we have to do. The other thing to note is that the blue line goes well below zero. The US fair share is actually so big that we have to reduce our emissions to negative in order to meet it. And that means not only do we need to decarbonize our entire economy, but we actually have to suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere at a massive rate, actually roughly half the rate of at which we're spewing them out today. That's a problem. Not only is it's probably scientifically and technically impossible, but even if we were to try, we would have to resort to dangerous and unproven geoengineering experiments with possibly disastrous side effects. So the green dotted line shows us an emissions trajectory that we could actually achieve, would be technically possible with enough effort and without geoengineering. But that leaves, of course, that shaded area left, which is an unmet part of our fair share. So then the question is, how do we get to the blue line? And the answer is by providing finance and technology for poorer countries to go beyond their fair shares. What do I mean by that? This is a chart for Thailand. It's fairly representative of many developing countries. You can see the brownish shade there is Thailand's fair share in a 1.5 degree scenario. And you can also see its pledges, which are roughly in line, could be improved, but are at least at maybe the correct scale. But the other thing to note is the green line. That is Thailand's mitigation potential, or the amount of emissions that could be cut from its baseline. And it's actually way more than Thailand's fair share. And if you look at even poorer countries, they have even smaller fair shares and even more gap between, in many cases, between mitigation potential and the fair share. So it wouldn't be fair to expect Thailand to go beyond the blue line on its own, but rich countries like the US can provide the necessary support, finance, and technology to enable Thailand to reach its full mitigation potential. And in that way, the US can end up meeting our fair share by financing emissions cuts elsewhere in the world. Now, one key thing to note is that this is not an offset. We are not saying that the US should pay other countries to reduce emissions so that we can continue polluting ourselves and continue business as usual. What we're saying is that we have to do everything we can to cut our emissions, and we have to give financial support to help poorer countries go beyond their fair shares. Now, the overriding point is this. There's really no way for the world to reach the 1.5 degree goal without a huge level of international cooperation, with all countries doing their fair share, but that includes rich countries providing huge amounts of finance for action in poorer countries so that they can meet their full mitigation potential.
So we've really been focusing on what would be fair, but this isn't just about what would be fair. This really is also about what is simply necessary, what is politically necessary in order to solve the climate problem. Keeping warming below 1.5, having emissions plummet as they have in all those charts we've shown, requires a massive transformation in the global economy. And a country just won't commit itself to that kind of transformation, that kind of investment, that kind of policy attention, especially a country that has other pressing developmental needs like eradicating poverty, unless they see other countries also doing their fair share. No country wants to be taken for a fool while other countries, especially wealthier countries, free ride. The second point is that it's built into the structure of the climate problem in this world that the only fair and just way to do this is one that involves unprecedented levels of international cooperation between wealthier and poorer countries. And that's because the moral obligation primarily lies in the wealthier countries. That's where the responsibility is. That's where the capability to solve the problem is. But most of the reductions ultimately need to happen in poorer countries. That's where emissions are currently about 2/3 of the global total. That's where industrialization and urbanization is finally happening. That's where energy services are finally being extended to the majority of their populations. So international cooperation, meaning cooperation that makes it possible to invest the necessary resources where they're most needed, is the only way to actually achieve a workable solution. Brandon, anything further you want to say?
I would just say that it's heartening to see that the idea of fair shares is actually taking root in mainstream US politics now. Bernie Sanders' recently released Green New Deal plan has language around the US doing its fair share, and it includes a large amount of money for the Green Climate Fund to support action in poorer countries. So that's a really a great first step. So you can see on your screen that there are pictures of the reports that this coalition has put out. These reports use the methodology we talked about today, and they put them in the context of an advocacy agenda for getting countries to do their fair shares. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can click the link below to civilsociettyreview.org, where you can find all of those reports. And if you have questions about anything you saw and heard on this webinar, feel free to leave a comment and we'll try to respond to any of those that we get. So thanks for watching, and thank you for your passion and your commitment to fixing the climate crisis.